In this video, I'm going to describe some of the rules that govern security in AIR applications, particularly in regard to which code you can execute and what assets or resources on the local system that code can access at runtime. AIR is built around the concept of security sandboxes. The capabilities of a particular set of code are determined by the origin of the code and how that affects what it's allowed to touch in the application environment. Each security sandbox has equivalent permissions. For example, dynamic code that's loaded at runtime from a web-based resource cannot be allowed to touch the local file system, local database, or other local resources. Because that code has not gone through your security framework and the user hasn't explicitly accepted that code during the installation process, it's not allowed to touch that outer world. That's how security sandboxes are designed. In the classic world of the web browser, for example, JavaScript code that's loaded either as part of or linked to a web page can touch anything within that web page and anything else within the web browser security sandbox, but can't move outside the security sandbox. Now, the reason this is so important in the world of AIR is because as soon as you start working with the web browser component, you actually have the ability to download code and execute it at runtime. The question is, what is that code allowed to do? There are 5 security sandboxes known as the application, remote, local trusted, local with networking, and local with file system sandboxes. I'm going to describe each of these sandboxes, which code is considered to be a part of that sandbox, and what that code is allowed to do. The application sandbox consists of everything within the application folder. That is, everything that you can reach either through the app:/URI or through file.application directory. As I've mentioned within previous chapters, content within that folder cannot be modified by the Flex application itself at runtime, but code within that folder does have access to all other local resources such as the file system and database. Application-based code gives you access to all of the privileged AIR system APIs, the APIs that modify the file system, the database, and network communication capabilities. On the other hand, you can't dynamically import code and execute it directly from within the application area, and for the most part, dynamic code generation techniques are disallowed as well. Because the application environment contains code that for the most part has been compiled or otherwise checked, that code can touch the local file system, but code that you download from outside the application domain cannot be allowed to do the same. The remote sandbox consists of all the code that's downloaded from the internet at runtime, such as JavaScript code that's a part of or linked to a web page. The rules for this code are pretty much the same as classic web browsers. There are actually a few more restrictions than in a classic web browser environment, because the AIR environment does give you so much access to the local system. If you download Flash documents or Flex applications at runtime, the rules for that code are the same as when the code is run in the Flash player. That is, if you use the HTML component and download a Flex application, just because that Flex application is running in an AIR environment doesn't mean the code within the downloaded application can get to the local file system. It can't. And that's the way you want it. This means that any code that the user is running that's accessing their local resources is code that they've explicitly accepted during the installation process, and not code that's just been arbitrarily downloaded. There are 3 other sandboxes that apply to locally stored content. Local trusted content is stored locally and has been explicitly marked as trusted, using either the Flash Player Settings Manager or a trust configuration file. These files can read from local data sources and can communicate with the internet, and don't have to be loaded into the application directory. On the other hand, there are some limitations to the privileges accorded this code that are only available through the application sandbox. The next sandbox is called local with networking. This kind of content is made up of a Swift file that's published with a networking designation, that is, that's been compiled with networking built in. Only Swift-based content can be considered to be a part of this sandbox. It does not have to be explicitly trusted by the user to do what it does, and it can communicate with the internet, but it cannot read from local data sources or the local file system. Finally, the local with file system sandbox. Local scripting files are a part of the sandbox when they have not been published with a networking designation and have not been explicitly trusted. This includes JavaScript files that have not been explicitly trusted and are not a part of the application sandbox. These files can read from local data sources, but can't communicate with the Internet. There's a lot to know about air security, and there are some great resources to help you out with a lot of the details. Here are 2 article and documentation recommendations. First, an article on the Air Developer Center at introductiontoairsecurity.html. This article covers the basic idea of sandboxes and describes at a high level what sandboxes are for and what they do. And a more detailed document, airsecurity.pdf at this URL, which goes much more in depth into the world of security in air applications.